I went out with friends for drinks last month and the night got a bit messy. I don't remember exactly when, but after bar hopping with my friends, I decided to call it a night. They wanted to keep going and I just wanted to get back to my bed. So I did what I thought I was supposed to do, hailed a taxi and got in, gave the driver my address, and then everything goes black. I vaguely remember sinking into the seat, hearing the hum of the car engine, feeling safe that I'd be home soon. The next thing I remember is waking up, still in my clothes from the night before, my shoes kicked off beside my bed. For a second I actually felt relieved. I must have made it home okay. I didn't think too hard about how, just brushed it off, figuring I was lucky I'd somehow gotten home safely. But as the morning went on, I couldn't shake this strange feeling. I texted my friends, asked if any of them had seen me get into a taxi or help me out of it. None of them had. They figured I'd just made it back myself, but I know I didn't walk home. I'd hailed that taxi. I barely remembered it, but I know I got into a car. Later that night, I got a text. The message just said, "Did you make it home safe?" I stared at my phone for a long moment, confused. I had no idea who it was from, so I asked, "Who's this?" Then they replied, "Your driver from last night." I felt my stomach twist a little. I hadn't given my number to any driver. How would he have gotten it? I typed back, asking how he got my number. He replied saying he'd gone through my phone while I was asleep. That single message flipped my whole world upside down. He'd gone through my phone while I was unconscious in the back seat. I blocked the number immediately. The whole thing creeped me out, but I convinced myself he'd move on if I ignored him. He was just a weird guy, probably crossing the line for his own amusement, I thought. I wanted to let it go. A few days later, I was heading to work when I noticed something folded in my apartment door. It was a note, a simple scrawled message that read, "You looked peaceful sleeping." I felt a wave of nausea, and my brain raced, trying to make sense of it. The handwriting was shaky, barely legible. I kept telling myself it was just some prank, that it had to be a coincidence, that I was being paranoid, but I couldn't ignore it. At work, I kept glancing over my shoulder, thinking I saw him standing outside, just barely out of sight. I went straight to my manager, asking if she'd seen anyone hanging around. She hadn't, and I told her I was probably just paranoid, that I'd had a weird experience the weekend before and was on edge. She reassured me that I was safe, that the building was secure. A few days later, I got another message from a different number. It was him again. "You look beautiful in that black dress," he wrote. I nearly threw my phone across the room, realizing he must have been watching me that day. My heart raced and I knew I had to go to the police. They took my statement, looked over the text, but they couldn't do much. They told me to stay alert and suggested I avoid being alone when possible. I couldn't believe how little they could help me. After the visit to the police, the text stopped for a while. I was starting to feel a little better, thinking maybe he'd given up. Then I came home one night and found another note on my door. This one said, "Blocking me won't keep me away." At this point, I was terrified to even leave my apartment. I started asking friends to stay over, not wanting to be alone, but I couldn't live like that forever. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was nearby, watching and waiting. I stopped using my usual coffee shop, took different routes to work, and even changed my shifts, hoping to throw him off. But it didn't stop him. Last week, I found another note. This one was taped to my bathroom mirror. He had somehow gotten inside my apartment. The note was shorter this time. "I love you." Panicking, I called the police again, but by the time they arrived, there was no trace of anyone, no signs of forced entry. The officers couldn't find any evidence he'd broken in, and since nothing was missing, they didn't take it too seriously. They did a sweep, told me to call if anything else happened, and left. A couple of days ago, I did more digging on my own, searching for any information on this guy. I contacted the cab company, but they had no records of a driver picking me up that night. They even went back through their data and showed me the routes taken by every driver near that area and time. There was nothing. No one from their company had picked me up, meaning I'd gotten into some random car that night. I had no idea who this guy was or what he wanted or how long he'd been watching me. I went to a friend's birthday party last weekend. It was supposed to be a low-key gathering, just a bunch of us catching up, sharing drinks, and enjoying a nice night out. I hadn't been out much recently, so I figured it'd be a good way to get back into the social scene. Everything was fine at first, just the usual catching up, a few drinks, a little bit of laughter. At some point I ended up talking to a woman who I didn't remember meeting before. She had a confident energy about her, like she was used to being the center of attention. We started chatting. And it was mostly the usual stuff at first, work, movies, that kind of thing, but gradually her questions started to get personal. She wanted to know about my schedule, where I worked, my plans for the weekend. I started feeling a little strange about it as the night went on, though. She seemed intensely focused on every word I said. There was an odd look in her eyes that I couldn't shake. It was subtle, but it started to make me a bit uncomfortable. I decided to make my exit early. I had work the next day anyway, and I figured leaving would avoid any awkwardness that might be brewing. I got home, locked up, and went straight to bed. I didn't think about her again. I'd only known her for a few hours, so she wasn't exactly on my mind by the time I was winding down. I fell asleep easily. The next morning, groggy, I dragged myself out of bed and stumbled toward the kitchen, starting the day with some coffee as I normally would. When I walked in, I froze. Sitting at my dining table was the woman from the party. She was just sitting there, calm as anything, with a slice of the birthday cake on a small plate in front of her. She looked up at me with this unsettling grin, holding a fork in her hand. And then she just watched me, not moving, not saying a thing, just sitting there, grinning as if it was the most normal thing in the world. It was like she was waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't get any words out. My mind was racing, trying to figure out how she'd gotten into my apartment. I knew I'd locked the door behind me, and there were no signs of forced entry. The idea that someone I barely knew had managed to let herself in made my stomach twist. The plate in front of her seemed to mock me. I could see the little coloured sprinkles, the familiar pink frosting. She must have taken it from the party on her way out. I had this sick realization that she'd somehow followed me home without me noticing. And here she was, like she belonged, as if we were just sharing a casual morning together. I tried to stay calm and asked her how she'd gotten in. She didn't answer, just kept smiling, occasionally cutting into the cake with her fork and taking slow bites. I felt myself start to shake, my heartbeat pounding. Her eyes never left me, and that look, that knowing too close look, was more than I could handle. In that moment, I decided I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone and pretended to call someone, hoping it would prompt her to leave or give me an opening to slip out, but when I turned my head back, she was gone. Not like she'd gotten up and left through the door, she was just gone. I scoured the apartment, checking every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing. I called the police, who couldn't find anything themselves. She had vanished as if she'd never been there. The only trace was that half-eaten slice of cake still on the plate. It looked untouched, but there was the faint imprint of her lipstick on the fork. That was the only thing left. I threw the plate away and spent the rest of the day trying to put it out of my mind, but sleep didn't come easy that night. The worst part? Over the next few days, I started seeing her, on my commute, in stores, even across the street from my apartment, always at a distance, watching, never getting close, just there, lingering at the edges of my life. It's been a week. I've taken different routes, changed my routine, but she's always there, watching. I haven't told anyone about it. Honestly, I'm not sure if anyone would believe me. I've worked as a nurse on the same ward for years, and while it's sometimes chaotic, I love my job. I always try to treat patients with warmth and kindness. People can be scared and vulnerable in a hospital. A few months ago, we had a new patient admitted. Let's call him Tim. Tim had suffered a pretty bad accident, but he was recovering well, and I made sure to check in on him often to see if he needed anything. At first, Tim seemed just grateful, maybe a bit lonely, but soon he started making comments that set off red flags. Little compliments became oddly personal, moving past the typical thanks for the help into "you have the most beautiful smile, and it's so nice to have someone as caring as you looking after me." I shrugged it off as misplaced gratitude, especially since he'd been through a traumatic experience. But over time, his interest in me started to intensify. He'd ask me if I was single, and I would always respond with a firm no, and mention my husband, hoping it would deter him. Instead, it seemed to fuel his fascination. He'd say things like, "Your husband's a lucky guy," or "maybe we should hang out once I'm better." I always kept my responses professional, steering things back to his recovery, but I could see in his eyes that he was getting the wrong impression. After a few weeks, he was well enough to go home, and I thought that would be the end of it. But he kept coming back, showing up with new ailments that seemed increasingly fabricated. One week he claimed he had shortness of breath. Another, he said he'd felt dizzy while walking to his mailbox. These were symptoms that would normally lead to observation, so he kept getting readmitted. I wasn't the only one who noticed. The other nurses would comment that he'd light up whenever I walked into the room, staring at me and trying to engage me in conversation. He'd always try to get me to stay longer, asking questions about my day, my shift hours, or if I ever got lonely working all night. It was unsettling, and every visit felt worse than the last. Eventually, the doctors and charge nurse realized something was off, and he was flagged for what was, in medical terms, a psychosomatic focus. Tim was told he wouldn't be admitted anymore unless he had a legitimate emergency. I remember feeling so relieved, hoping this was finally the end, but it wasn't, not even close. One evening, after an exhausting shift, I left the hospital and walked to my car in the dimly lit parking lot. As I opened the door, I noticed movement. There, standing just a few cars away, was Tim, his gaze locked on me, a strange expression on his face. My stomach twisted as I quickly got in, locked the doors and drove off. I told myself it was just a coincidence, that maybe he'd had a legitimate reason to be near the hospital, even though I knew he'd been discharged a few days before. The next week, my husband mentioned that he'd seen a man standing across the street from our house when he came home from work. He hadn't thought much of it at the time, but when he described the man, scruffy-looking, dark hoodie, standing very still, I knew it was Tim. I tried to rationalize it. I didn't want to think he was actually following me, but the feeling gnawed at me, and I started looking over my shoulder constantly, on edge whenever I left the house. Then it got worse. Tim started leaving little notes on my car windshield, mostly handwritten, scrawling messages that veered between affectionate and obsessive. "It's fate that we met. I know you're too nice to say it, but I know you care about me. I can make you happier than him." Sometimes he'd leave flowers, half-wilted ones, picked off bushes. I felt trapped in a bizarre, horrifying nightmare. I showed the notes to my husband, who was furious. He wanted to confront Tim directly, but I was scared that would make things worse. We decided to report it to the hospital security, and they put a patrol near the staff parking, but they couldn't do anything outside of the premises. One night, as I was walking into my house, I saw a shadow shift near the side of my property. I froze, realizing it was Tim, lurking in my garden, watching. My husband stormed outside, yelling for him to leave. Tim didn't say a word, just watched us with that blank, unsettling expression before slinking back into the shadows. The next day, my husband insisted I file a police report. I did, but without a direct threat. They could only take a statement. They advised me to keep a record of any future incidents. After that, things quieted down for a while. I started to feel a bit safer, hoping he'd given up. But then I found another note, this time in our mailbox. It was longer than the others, a rambling letter that claimed he'd wait as long as it took, and knew I felt the same deep down. The letter mentioned details he couldn't have known, like a small charm bracelet I wore, a picture I kept on my desk at work, even the name of my dog. This time I was terrified. The final straw came just a few days ago. I was working a night shift when my husband called, sounding panicked. He told me he'd seen Tim in our yard, crouching near our back door. My husband had shouted at him to leave, and Tim just stood there for a few moments before backing away. I couldn't believe this was still happening. It felt like we were in a nightmare that we couldn't wake up from. I called the police again, this time begging them to take action. They sent officers to patrol the area, and my husband and I are now looking into a restraining order. We've installed cameras around the property, and every time I leave work, I'm terrified he'll be there waiting. My heart races whenever I see anyone lingering nearby, my mind immediately jumping to the worst-case scenario. I don't know what else to do. I had just finished a long day at work and didn't feel like cooking, so I ordered a pizza. It was already late, the streets outside were quiet, and I settled onto my couch to wait. A little while later, I got a text from the delivery guy. "On my way." Pretty standard, but a few minutes after, he texted again saying, "Can't wait to meet you." That was weird, but figured he was just being friendly. So when the doorbell rang, I grabbed my cash and opened the door. He was standing there, holding the pizza box, smiling wide. He handed it over, and then he looked me up and down. He said, "Wow, you're beautiful." I froze for a second. It was just a bit too much, especially from a stranger. I managed a quick "thank you" and shut the door, locking it right away. Not 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was him again. "Can't stop thinking about you. You're perfect." I stared at my phone, feeling my stomach twist. I didn't reply, hoping he'd just move on, but the messages kept coming, one after another. I feel like I know you, like we're meant to be. Please respond, I just want to talk. My hands were shaking as I watched each message appear faster and faster until my phone buzzed non-stop. He started calling me baby and darling, writing about how he needed to see me again. My heart was racing as I blocked his number. I felt violated, creeped out in my own home. I double-checked that my door was locked and peered out my window just to make sure he was gone. The street was empty, but I couldn't shake this feeling like he was nearby. I tried to calm down, to tell myself it was over. Then a new number started texting. Why aren't you answering, baby? I just want to see you again, just one more time. My blood went cold. He must have gotten a new number to keep texting me. I blocked that one too, but he found another, and another. He was relentless, bombarding me with messages about how we were meant to be together, and how nobody could love you like I do. Each text was worse, as if he knew I was reading and ignoring him, which only made him more desperate. I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police, telling them everything, showing them the texts. They asked for his name and the delivery details, and I gave them the time of the delivery, hoping it would help them track him down. They assured me they'd look into it, but for that night, there wasn't much else they could do except tell me to stay inside and keep my doors locked. The messages didn't stop. Every few hours, a new number, more messages. His tone changed, first pleading, then angry. He started calling me horrible names, talking about how I was just like all the others. There was something disturbing in the way he wrote about me, like he was entitled to know everything about me, and furious that I wasn't giving it to him. When I called the pizza place the next day, they told me they had no idea who he was. According to them, the guy assigned to my delivery was different from the person who showed up. The driver who was supposed to have delivered to me swore he'd never been there, that he'd never even left his car during the shift. The manager assured me they'd look into it, but the whole thing just made me feel even more unsafe. I spent days on edge, jumping at every little noise, checking my phone constantly. I didn't hear anything from the police, so I called them back for an update. They'd looked into it, but no one had been able to find the man who came to my door. He didn't show up on any cameras, didn't leave any real name or contact info. It was like he'd just disappeared after delivering the pizza. Even when I asked around my neighborhood, no one had seen him. And then the texts suddenly stopped. I waited, kept my phone by me constantly, but not a single new message came. After a few days, I started to feel a bit of relief. Maybe he'd finally given up, moved on to someone else. Maybe the police had done something behind the scenes that they hadn't told me about. Then, late one night, I woke up to a single notification. My hands shook as I picked up my phone, already dreading what I'd see. One message from a new number: "You will be mine." I've always been pretty active on social media, sharing pictures from my day-to-day life. Mostly harmless stuff. Selfies, snapshots with friends, pretty scenery when I'm out and about. A couple of months ago, I noticed this older guy, I'll call him Matt, liking every single post. At first, it was just flattering, you know? Another follower who was really into my photos. But his comments started getting weird. He'd write things about my smile, my clothes, the way I styled my hair. I didn't think too much of it at first, but the intensity of his comments escalated quickly. He'd say things like, "Would you date an older man?" and "I love you." Eventually, it got so creepy that I blocked him. I felt relieved, but a little shaken. I brushed it off as just another internet creep. But after that, something way more disturbing started happening. I'd post a picture and I'd notice a figure in the background. Nothing obvious at first, just a dark shape, blurred in a crowd, or someone standing far off in the distance. But each time I post, the figure would be closer, clearer. In one picture, taken while I was grabbing coffee with a friend, I spotted him clearly standing across the street facing the cafe. At first, I told myself it was just a coincidence. It was a city street, people were always around. But then I looked back at my other recent pictures. Each time he was closer, unmistakably him. He was on a park bench just a few feet behind me in a shot from last week, and even in the reflection of a store window as I posed with a new dress. I'd blocked him on my socials, but he was still there, somehow, watching. I stopped posting as much, hoping he'd lose interest, but last weekend a friend took a picture of me without me knowing. She uploaded it, tagging me in the post. It was just us sitting on a bench in the park laughing, but there he was, directly behind me, staring into the camera, his face obscured slightly, but clear enough that I could tell it was him. I felt sick. I hadn't seen him in person, hadn't spotted him watching me in real time, but he was always there, always in the background, like some shadow attached to me. I started getting paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder. I stopped going out alone, convinced he was around every corner, lurking in every crowd. A few days ago, I posted one last picture, hoping it would give me some control over the situation. I made sure no one else was around, took the picture in a totally empty hallway in my apartment building. I'd closed the door behind me, snapped the shot quickly and posted it to see if he'd appear again. When I looked back at the photo, my stomach dropped. There he was, standing right behind me in the dim hallway, his hand almost reaching out to touch my shoulder. I moved into my new place about a year ago. It's not a high-end apartment by any means, but it's mine, and I've tried to make it feel cozy and safe. I started fresh here after a tough breakup with my ex, who had moved out of state. Things ended messily, but after a while I began to feel like I could put it behind me. That is, until I started noticing certain things I just couldn't explain. It began with this faint, musky smell, something I hadn't encountered since my last place. At first it was just here and there, an odd hint of cologne as I walked past the couch, a lingering scent in the hallway. It was so subtle I dismissed it, told myself I was imagining things. I bought a few air fresheners, thinking maybe it was something about the building or some neighbor's cologne seeping in. But it got worse. The smell started following me around my apartment, lingering on my clothes even. I'd be cooking or reading and suddenly catch a whiff, instantly reminded of him. It's hard to describe, but it was his, a particular smell that I couldn't associate with anyone else. The feeling of being unsettled only grew when I began to find things slightly out of place. At first, it was just small, easy-to-miss stuff. Keys turned a different way, a pen moved from one side of my desk to the other. But then there were bigger things, like my kitchen drawers being open, clothes strewn around my room that I didn't remember touching. Once I came home to find my favorite mug at the very front of the cabinet, almost like it was waiting for me. I hadn't used it in months, but there it was, clean and easy to reach. It was the kind of mug he'd often grabbed for himself when we'd lived together. The weirdness of it all kept building until I could no longer dismiss it. Then there was the smell in my bedroom. It was strongest there, so intense at times that it made my skin crawl. I tried washing everything, throwing open windows, using sprays, anything to scrub the air clean. But that muskiness lingered, growing stronger no matter what I did. The last straw came when I found a small item on my bathroom counter, an old watch of his. It was unmistakably his, worn out and cracked in a way that couldn't be replicated. He used to leave it on our bathroom sink whenever he'd shower, and I remembered the exact feeling of seeing it there. But I hadn't seen that watch in over a year. I knew something was terribly, terribly off. I couldn't avoid it anymore. I hadn't spoken to him since the breakup, and had heard from mutual friends that he'd left town, supposedly a fresh start somewhere else. But now I wasn't so sure. I had this feeling that he was somehow still nearby, watching. After that, I began triple-checking every door and window. I'd lock up, listen carefully, and make sure everything was secure before bed. But no matter what, I kept finding signs that someone had been inside, just subtle enough that it was easy to question myself, but I couldn't ignore it any longer. I knew he had to be getting in somehow. One night I couldn't sleep. Every sound in the apartment felt amplified, my ears catching every creak and groan of the floorboards. As I lay there in the dark, I heard a soft shuffle coming from somewhere near my living room. I felt frozen, my heart pounding, every instinct telling me not to move. After what felt like hours, I finally worked up the courage to go look. I grabbed my phone, flashlight on, and crept down the hallway, but there was no one there. The door was locked and all the windows were latched shut. Everything seemed exactly as I'd left it, and yet that scent was still there, almost taunting me, as if he'd been sitting in my living room only moments before. The next day I decided I couldn't stay there anymore. I made plans to move in with a friend until I could figure out what was happening. Before I left, I went through every inch of my apartment hoping to find something, some kind of clue, but found nothing. I started working at the distribution warehouse about 3 months ago. It was a decent job for a night shift, which I took on to help pay off some debts. The hours were long, but the pay was good enough that I could manage. At first, it seemed like a standard gig, moving boxes, sorting shipments, that sort of thing, but I quickly learned that my supervisor, Kyle, was anything but standard. At first, I thought nothing of it. Kyle seemed to be a pretty intense guy, always serious and focused on getting the job done. He kept a close watch on everyone, but it was especially noticeable with me. I'd be moving pallets in the back when I'd catch him watching from the shadows of the aisles, his eyes boring into me. It felt like he was always there, just out of sight, but it was too surreal to really think much of it. I shrugged it off, told myself I was just being paranoid. After all, it was the night shift, and everything feels a little strange when it's just you and a few other workers in a big empty warehouse. As the weeks went by, his scrutiny didn't lessen. Whenever I tried to take a break, Kyle would suddenly appear, leaning against a wall, arms crossed, silently observing me. No matter where I went, even just to the bathroom, he seemed to know. I'd catch him glancing my way when I returned, his face inscrutable. The other guys on the shift didn't seem to notice, but I began to feel like a specimen in some twisted experiment. One night, after a long shift, I stopped by a small diner for some coffee. The place was nearly empty, but there he was, sitting in a booth at the far end, his eyes fixed on me. I felt my heart race as I turned quickly, hoping he wouldn't see me. I ducked into the restroom, taking a moment to breathe. When I came out, he was gone. The next few weeks turned into a maddening cycle of his presence. Each night I'd find myself trying to anticipate his moves, changing where I took my breaks, altering my routine in a desperate attempt to gain some distance. Yet without fail, he'd show up at the same store, the same park, the same cafe. Eventually I found myself unable to shake the dread. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, convinced he was lurking just outside my window, waiting for the right moment. My sleep became restless, filled with dark dreams of him closing in on me, his face twisted in a predatory grin. I shared my concerns with a couple of co-workers, but they dismissed my fears, suggesting I was just overworked and exhausted. Perhaps they were right, but there was something about Kyle's eyes that I couldn't shake, something unsettling. One night I gathered enough courage to confront him. I waited for my break, expecting him to materialize as usual, but this time I stood my ground, watching him as he came closer. Instead of the usual silence, he smirked at me, a strange, unnerving grin that sent chills down my spine. I mumbled something about needing space, and he just chuckled, the sound echoing eerily in the empty warehouse. I wanted to quit, to leave that job behind, but the financial strain kept me anchored. Then one night, everything changed. I clocked out and hurried to my car, eager to escape, but I noticed him leaning against the hood of my vehicle. He was waiting for me, a predatory look in his eyes. As I approached, my heart raced, and I tried to think of a way to get away, but it was too late. He straightened, closing the distance between us. I could barely breathe as he leaned closer, his voice a low murmur, yet filled with a twisted kind of mirth. I backed away instinctively, adrenaline kicking in, urging me to run. In that moment, I realized there was no escape. I darted to my car, fumbling with the keys, my hands shaking as I desperately tried to unlock the door. Just as I got it open, I heard him laugh. A chilling sound that echoed in the still night air. I drove away, my heart racing, desperate to put miles between us. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, watching me go, that same eerie grin plastered across his face. Even as I left the warehouse behind, the feeling of his gaze pressed down on me, haunting me, refusing to let go. I avoided the warehouse, quit my job, and tried to rebuild my life. Yet every time I turned a corner or walked into a store, I'd half expect to see him. It started out so well with him. We had that kind of bond where it felt like nothing could break us, but over time things changed. It was subtle at first, just a few minor disagreements. I'd roll my eyes, he'd sigh, and we'd move on. But the bickering snowballed until we were arguing daily about the most ridiculous things. How I folded laundry, where he'd leave his shoes, who left the lights on. The little things built up until they turned into explosive arguments about absolutely everything. Then one day he lost his temper, crossing a line I couldn't ignore. I told him to leave, and he did, storming out with a mess of accusations and slamming the door behind him. It was exhausting, and I felt relieved when I got a message from mutual friends saying he'd moved to another city far away. Months passed, and I heard nothing from him, and eventually I started to feel like I could actually move on, but then strange things started happening around my house. It began with small, unassuming things that were easy to overlook. My toothbrush would be moved slightly out of place, or a blanket on the couch that I hadn't touched would be left in a mess. Sometimes the TV would be on a channel I hadn't watched, or a mug I'd left in the sink would be washed and placed neatly in the cabinet. One day I was searching for a specific shirt and found it folded in a way I never fold my clothes. It was such a distinct fold, the way he used to do it, and I felt this odd pang of familiarity, like he was in the room, standing just behind me. A few weeks later, I started noticing his cologne lingering faintly in the air. The first time I was in the living room, and it was like he just walked by. I even went to the front door and checked outside, but there was no one. I went back inside, the smell still hanging in the air, a sharp reminder of him. It should have been impossible. He was in a different city, hundreds of miles away. I told myself I was imagining things, but it happened more and more. I'd find little reminders of him everywhere. A book he loved open on my nightstand, his favorite snack on the counter even though I hadn't bought it, and once his old razor lying on the bathroom sink. One evening I was reading in bed, trying to unwind and forget about it all, when I heard a cough, soft but unmistakable, right above me. I froze, trying to reason it out. I lived in a detached house, so there was no neighbor who could have made that sound. Heart pounding, I lay there, hoping it was just my imagination. But then it happened again, louder, followed by a faint creak of movement. Something inside me snapped. Filled with adrenaline, I jumped out of bed, grabbed a flashlight, and made my way to the hallway toward the attic hatch. I pulled the ladder down slowly, every inch of me trembling, and shone the light up into the darkness. As I climbed, the smell hit me first. It was a mixture of stale air and his familiar musky cologne. I reached the top, the beam of the flashlight flickering over the dusty floorboards, and there, just beyond the light, was a small makeshift bed in the corner. Old blankets, some of my clothes, and even half-eaten food containers were piled up next to it. My heart was pounding so loudly I thought I might pass out, and then I heard a slow, measured breath coming from behind me. It was freshers' week at uni, and like everyone else, I was diving into the whole scene, parties, meeting people, just trying to make friends and settle in. I'm Owen, a first year, and I'm doing computer science. I'd met a couple of people from my course, but you know how it is, everyone's trying to be friendly and you don't remember half the names the next day, but there was one guy who stuck out. I met him during one of the parties that week. He seemed interesting, a bit quiet, but friendly enough, and we ended up talking for most of the night. I don't remember his name exactly, but let's call him Ben. We talked about music, games, and courses. He said he was doing something in engineering, though he didn't get into specifics. At first he seemed like a decent guy, but over the next few weeks things got weird. In the beginning, I'd see him around campus occasionally, just random run-ins, and he'd stop to chat. I thought, hey, it's nice he's friendly, maybe we'll end up being mates. But then it started happening more and more often. It didn't matter where I was. Leaving the library, walking to a lecture, grabbing food in the canteen, he'd appear, always just behind me, like he was waiting for me to notice him, and then he'd slip into step beside me. I didn't want to be rude, so I went along with it. He got this habit of trailing behind me and my friend, just hanging back without really joining the conversation. I'd introduce him, thinking he'd make an effort to chat with everyone else, but he just hovered there, listening, not really saying much unless it was directed at me. And he'd make these odd comments or ask personal questions, just stuff you wouldn't normally ask someone you barely knew. My friends started noticing too. They'd give me looks or ask quietly if I was all right with him around, but I kept telling them he was just new like us, probably nervous about making friends, but even I was starting to get creeped out. One evening, I was leaving a pub with some course mates and I spotted him across the street, just watching. I hadn't even told him I was going out that night, so how did he know where I'd be? It was past midnight and he just stood there staring until I looked his way. Then he gave this slight wave and walked off into the dark. My stomach twisted seeing him there. Things came to a head when he started turning up at my lectures, even though he wasn't in computer science. I'd glance around and spot him a few rows back, watching me like he was waiting for me to do something. It got so bad that I started coming in late just to avoid him, slipping in after the lights went down so he wouldn't see me. The last straw came when I saw him outside my accommodation building. I hadn't mentioned where I was staying, yet he was standing there one evening when I got back, looking up at the windows like he was searching for mine. He spotted me walking to my accommodation. He came over and asked if he could come up to hang out. I felt a chill. I told him it wasn't a good time and practically ran inside, hoping he'd take the hint. That night, I had enough. I went to one of my tutors the next day, explaining that this guy was following me everywhere and it was freaking me out. I asked if they could look up his course, maybe talk to him and get him to back off. My tutor's face went blank when I described him, and she asked for his full name. By this point, I knew his full name. She went through the student record, searching for any Ben enrolled in engineering, but no one matched. I felt sick as she looked at me, her face pale, and said he wasn't registered in any course at our uni. I felt the room spin, like everything I thought I knew about the past few weeks was slipping out of focus. If he wasn't a student, what was he doing here? How had he gotten into our lectures, the libraries, the common areas? I spent the next week on edge, constantly looking over my shoulder, terrified I'd see him again. I didn't go out, didn't walk anywhere alone. It was like he'd vanished as soon as the tutor checked for him. Traveling alone was supposed to be my escape, a little getaway from the stress and routine. I'd booked a quiet hotel in a small, quaint town, hoping to soak up some local charm and just unwind. When I got to the hotel, everything seemed straightforward. Check-in was quick, and the receptionist handed me my key, assuring me the room was ready. As I got to my room, I didn't think twice before opening the door and letting myself in. I kicked off my shoes, sat on the bed, and stretched, feeling relieved to be off my feet after a long trip. I was already flipping through my plans for the day when the bathroom door swung open and a man stepped out, wrapped in a towel. We both screamed. The shock on his face mirrored my own, and for a few seconds, it was just wide-eyed panic. I felt like I'd walked into a scene that wasn't meant for me. After our initial shock, we managed to start talking, each accusing the other of intruding. He seemed genuinely bewildered, and I was just as confused. He explained he'd checked in the night before and everything was in order, which didn't make any sense to me because, according to the front desk, this was my room. Thinking it was a mix-up, I hurried down to reception to sort things out. The staff assured me I was assigned to that room, no mistake. They even checked their records to confirm that no other guests should be there. They looked just as puzzled as I felt, but they offered to send a bellboy up with me to double-check. When we returned, the room was empty. His things were gone. No towel, no luggage, no trace of anyone but me. I was rattled, and I couldn't shake that feeling off. The receptionist noticed my discomfort and offered to move me to another room. I agreed, eager to settle in somewhere that didn't carry such a bizarre encounter. I let myself relax, took a shower, and got ready to explore the town, convincing myself it was just a strange mishap. The town itself was charming, with cobblestone streets and cozy shops, but every so often I'd catch a glimpse of someone watching me. As I was window shopping, I saw him again, the man from my room. He was across the street, standing in front of a cafe. I froze, then turned away, pretending not to see him, hoping it was just my mind playing tricks on me. When I looked back, he was gone. But it didn't end there. Throughout the day, I saw him over and over. He'd be across the plaza in the reflection of a shop window or at the end of a narrow alley. Each time he was just standing there, watching. I could feel his gaze following me. I began taking random turns and ducking into crowds to lose him. Somehow, no matter where I went, I'd see him again a few streets over, as if he knew my every step. When evening came, I hurried back to the hotel, the thought of him making me want to lock myself in and not come out. The idea of seeing his face again, even from a distance, made my skin crawl. When I finally got to my new room, I felt an overwhelming relief, safe and sound, locked away from the strange encounters. I began unwinding and convincing myself it was all just one big misunderstanding. As I was turning down the bed for the night, I noticed a folded note on the pillow that I hadn't seen before. The handwriting was small and tidy, each letter meticulously placed. It simply read, "I hope to see you again, real soon."